Welcome to Unite Now, where we bring unity to you, wherever you are.
Hello everyone, and welcome to my session about high-fidelity graphics for games with the high-definition render pipeline for Unity. During the next hour, we're going to have a deep dive in HDRP's rendering and lighting settings. Hopefully, after watching this session, you will have a much better understanding of the key features of HDRP, and you should be able to increase the visual quality in your game projects. My name is Pierre Donzallaz. I'm a senior rendering artist at Unity. I specialize in lighting, rendering, user interface, and tools designs for art workflows. I worked as a lighting artist on several productions, such as the Crysis franchise, Rise, Grand Theft Auto 5, and more recently, Red Dead Redemption 2. What can you expect from this session? I will present to you several key features of HDRP. I will let you know how to install it and tune its main settings. I will then show you how to use the volume system. HDRP focuses a lot on physically correct setups, so I will spend a lot of time emphasizing photographic concepts for beginners. Therefore, we will also have a fairly long segment about exposure and lighting setups. We'll cover lights, shadows, reflections, and fog. We'll end the session talking about the most important post effects, like tone mapping and depth of field. You might recognize the environment I use. It is based on the Amalienborg Palace in Copenhagen, and it was recently used for a demo Unity produced in collaboration with Lexus. It was a showcase of virtual production for automotive scenarios. The entire environment is modeled in 3D, and it's a good testing ground to showcase the physically based lighting, the shadowing, the volumetrics, and the post-processing effects that HDRP has to offer. But first, let's see why you would want to use HDRP in the first place. The high-definition render pipeline has been designed to produce high-quality visuals, mostly for higher-end platforms such as desktop PC and consoles. It supports all the advanced rendering features you can expect from a modern rendering pipeline, and then some. It also has one of the most convenient post-processing pipelines out there. The lighting can be set in a physically correct way, and the shadowing quality can be pushed really far. HDRP also offers volumetric fog, so that you can better simulate thick atmospheres. You might think HDRP is tailored for photorealistic rendering. However, nothing prevents you from creating a very stylized game, as long as you're prepared to dig into Unity's shader graph to create a more distinct look. Let's see how you can install HDRP in a couple of clicks. First, you will certainly want to use the Unity Hub to download Unity. Then you can create a new project and pick a template. You could pick the HDRP template and you would be good to go. However, for this demonstration, I'll show you how to set up the HDRP from scratch with the 3D template. Once Unity is opened, open the package manager and search for high-definition render pipeline. Make sure you select the correct item in the list and then click the Install button. The installation process will take a couple of minutes to import the package and compile the assets. In the end, a nifty tool called the HDRP Wizard will pop up. If it detects problems with the setup of your project that might impact HDRP, it will let you know. Simply hit the Fix All button and accept any request from the tool, and your project will be good to go. To tune the HDRP graphics settings, go to Edit, Project Settings. In the Graphics section, you can see that an HDRP asset is already assigned to your project. If this field is empty, you can either look for the missing asset or run the HDRP wizard to fix this issue. This asset is saved on disk and contains all the HDRP quality settings for your project. You might have several HDRP assets if you wish to support multiple platforms, like consoles and PC, for instance, and have different settings for each. You can easily swap this asset in the editor or at runtime. Let's have a look at the many settings that can be tuned for HDRP. Let's head to Quality and then HDRP. You will be presented with a long list of features that you can enable globally for your project, and quality settings that you can set to fit your requirements. Keep in mind that whenever you enable something, HDRP will allocate resources for this feature, like memory and processing power. So you need to be careful and not enable features you have no need for, otherwise you might pay a performance cost unnecessarily. An important setting is the lit shader mode, which lets you choose between forward and deferred. The lit shader is normally applied to most opaque objects. In terms of visual quality, there are no major differences, although in theory, forward should give you the best shading precision, but at a cost. Therefore, you might want to stick to deferred for games and use forward for applications where performance isn't always a concern. What's great about our system is that you can select both modes. This way, if you head to the HDRP default settings, you can control independently how your cameras, baked reflection probes, and real-time reflection probes will render the lit shader. This could be helpful in certain situations where one mode might be a lot more efficient than the other one. For example, you could rely on deferred for the cameras and the real-time reflections, but use forward with multi-sampling anti-aliasing for the baked reflections to increase their quality. With HDRP, you even get custom settings for each of your cameras and probe objects. This way, you are able to override the lit shader mode for these objects and switch between deferred and forward, as well as toggling many other rendering features. I didn't mention yet that one major drawback of deferred is the lack of support for multi-sampling anti-aliasing. If you were to select it, the MSA within forward checkbox will be unselectable. But don't worry, this can be easily mitigated by using another type of anti-aliasing. In a minute, we will cover all types of anti-aliasing offered by HDRP. Finally, another way to control the rendering settings for your cameras is to use the render pipeline debug window. There, you'll be able to toggle features on and off for all the active cameras, including the scene camera. It is particularly useful when debugging and during your optimization pass. You'll be able to easily find out the source of the culprit. For instance, you can disable the rendering of transparent objects, the post-processing, or the fog, including the volumetric effects. And don't forget about the reset button, in case you want to quickly revert all the changes you've applied to the cameras. And remember, this window doesn't affect any of your scene data. Those changes are not saved. Previously, I've been talking briefly about multi-sampling anti-aliasing, or MSA for short. Let's go into more detail. The purpose of MSA is to remove the jagged edges along the polygons. It is an expensive effect, both in terms of memory consumption, bandwidth, and processing power, so it must be used with care. I've also mentioned deferred mode doesn't offer MSAA, so let's have a look at the alternatives. In your camera inspector, you will find several post-processing anti-aliasing techniques. As their name suggests, they are run during the post-processing phase of the rendering. The most affordable one is the Fast Approximate Anti-aliasing, or FXAA. It detects edges in the image and blurs them, no matter if they belong to geometries or textures. It has a very low impact on performance, but it often produces blurry results. It is a good solution, however, for lower-end platforms that can't always run more expensive solutions. Next is SMAA, which is a slightly more expensive solution that focuses on reducing temporal artifacts and improving the sharpness of the image. It doesn't always produce the best results, however, as it tends to favor sharpness and therefore can miss certain jaggies. Finally, temporal AA, or TAA, is one of the more advanced solutions that can combat most types of aliasing. It does require motion vectors to be enabled in your HDRP settings, however. These are anyway required for object motion blur, and they can be used to enhance other effects like screen space ambient occlusion, so you will probably want to keep them turned on in any case. You might observe some ghosting around fast-moving objects or trailing artifacts on new pixels that don't have a motion history yet. However, because the image is moving, it is fairly difficult to notice, except if you pause the rendering. TAA is also a great solution to prevent specular aliasing, like on this door, which uses a normal map to create the illusion of geometric details. In comparison, MSAA is totally unable to remove this type of aliasing because MSAA only works on polygons. HDRP even allows you to customize the sharpness of the effect depending on your tastes or artistic requirements. You can opt for a softer image or a sharper one. Let's have a quick recap. Here's the scene at 5x zoom with no anti-aliasing. Then with MSAA, FXAA, noticeably blurrier, SMAA, clearly sharper, and TAA, a good compromise. TAA is very popular nowadays as it provides a great mix of performance and visual quality, with a few caveats, however. Also, note that you can still combine MSAA with one of these techniques. For instance, you could use MSAA 2x with FXAA in case TAA isn't suitable for your project. Now, let's have a look at our scene in more detail. I have a very simple setup. I have two main game objects, one for the environment, with all the geometries, props and decals, and one for the lighting. I have 3 time of day options for afternoon, evening, and night. I also have a 4th overcast light setup that I only use for baking and testing assets in neutral lighting. In HDRP, many settings are set with a volume system. We'll get to this system in detail in a few minutes. As you can see, if I disable all my lighting objects, HDRP still automatically applies some basic settings to my scenes. This is to make sure I get at least a sky, some shadows, and a few basic post-processing effects. If I open my project settings and check the HDRP default settings, I can check which settings are applied by default. If you're not happy with these values, you can, of course, use your own based on your project's requirements. Just make sure you tick the override checkbox on the left to activate the override field. The whole idea with these settings is that you can tune the default values for your projects in this window, and then you can override them with volumes that you can place in your scene to customize the lighting for certain parts only of your level. For example, if I disable the sky overrides on my volume, it will revert to the default sky value I just showed you in the project settings. If I re-enable my sky overrides, the default settings of the project will be overridden by mines. Let's dig deeper in the volume system. Adding a volume is very simple. You can use one of the provided shortcuts that will have pre-applied components. Instead, I'll just create a volume from scratch so you can understand the system better. Make sure you rename your object properly. I'm going to assign a volume component to it. This volume can be global, which means it has infinite bounds, or it can be local. Let's keep it global for now, so that it affects the entire level, no matter where my camera is. For now, the volume doesn't do anything. That's because it doesn't have any profile assigned. So let's add one. These assets are stored on disk. It gives you a lot of flexibility to share them between volumes. The fun part can finally start. I can now add overrides to my volume. The list offers many overrides for fog, skies, post-processing effects, etc. We'll go through these in detail a bit later. I'm going to add a color adjustment effect first to tune the saturation. I actually want to create a very high contrast black and white style. So I'll need to add a color grading effect called Shadow Midtones Highlights. Let's drop the shadows radically, lift the highlights slightly, and reduce the midtones to enhance the dark tones even further. Remember that the volume component has a weight value that you can use to fade the effect in and out via script or timeline, for instance. Now let's switch the mode to local. As you can see, the effect disappears. That's because the volume doesn't have yet a physical size. So let's add a box collider to fix this. Then I can use the very practical handles to resize the volume to fit my needs. Then, as I move the camera inside the volume, you can see that the effect will activate immediately as I cross the boundary of the volume, and my grading disappears as soon as I leave the box. Obviously, those harsh transitions are rarely wanted, that's why we provide a blend distance. This way, you can have a very smooth transition entering and leaving the volume. There can sometimes be confusion about the global volumes. You can have several global volumes active at any given time. However, if you're not careful, you might end up with some conflicts between them. I'm now creating two global volumes. The first one will turn on the volumetric fog, whereas the other one will keep it disabled. So you can certainly understand that those two volumes are going to compete over the same parameter. How does HDRP decide which one will win over the other one? As you can see, the last active volume will take precedence over the other one. Naturally, this isn't a wanted behavior as it cannot be predictable. This is why you have the ability to set a priority for each volume. The volume with the highest priority will win whenever there's a conflict, like in this example with those two volumes fighting over the volumetric fog. You can obviously add these volume components to any game objects. Adding them to cameras with a local volume is an especially convenient way to not pollute your scene view with global volume settings. I'd recommend you avoid using global volumes unnecessarily, especially if a set of effects only apply to a certain camera or area. As you can see in this example, my game camera uses a very dense fog via a local fog volume. And it won't impact my scene view camera as long as it doesn't enter this local volume. If I use the global volume for that camera, my scene camera would also be constantly fogged out. Finally, you need to use a visual environment override when you want to change the type of sky, like PBR sky or HDRI sky. Only then will the overrides for the sky you chose be interpreted correctly by the volume system. Now, let's talk about the fundamentals of photography, and by extension rendering. Exposure is something beginners have a lot of trouble understanding. Sometimes the image turns entirely black, or it becomes too bright when pointing the camera at dark parts of the scene. Understanding exposure is therefore crucial to the lighting process, if you want to use physically based lighting especially. So, what's exposure? It's actually very simple. It's the amount of light that will affect the sensor of the camera. A high exposure value means a lot of light, whereas a very low exposure value means a low amount of light. For a sunny scene, your exposure might be at 14, whereas for a moonlit scene, it'd be around -1. Let's use the concept of the exposure triangle, very common in photography. But we won't go into too much details because it can get complicated very quickly if you've never heard about photography before. When your camera takes a photo, you or the camera will need to play with three main factors. In no particular order, we have the sensitivity. This defines how reactive the sensor is to the light. The more sensitive, the brighter the image. Then we have the shutter speed. This defines how long the camera will take to absorb the light. This is controlled by a mechanical or electronic shutter. And finally, we have the aperture. This controls how wide the opening of the lens will be. This is controlled by the aperture blades inside the lens. These blades open to bring more light onto the sensor and close to reduce the amount of light, exactly like the iris in your eyes. Whenever you take a photo, each of those three parameters can be increased or decreased to reach the desired exposure. Here's the formula that will give you the exposure value based on the settings the camera or you picked. Let's have a look at a few photos I took with a smartphone and see what the exposure value will be. Here we have a daylight shot. If we check the properties of the image, we can see the aperture is given by the f number at 1.7. The shutter speed, usually given as a fraction, is here at 1/2480, and the sensitivity, that's the ISO value, is at 100. If you plug these numbers into the formula I gave previously, you end up with an exposure value of 13. Here we have an overcast shot, and using the formula, the exposure value is around 10. With the sunset, we are at 8, in a very bright interior around 6, at night with artificial lighting about 2, and in a very dark interior around 1. Now, you should have a pretty good idea of what the exposure value corresponds to. And you should be able to look up any of your photo and calculate the exposure value for yourself. This is especially useful if you want to recreate a certain real-world scene in 3D in Unity. And you don't need a fancy camera for this, any smartphone will do. If you want to light your scene in a physically correct way, it is crucial that you use the right exposure. If you don't, you will have many lighting inconsistencies, and it will be much harder to balance your scene between natural and artificial lighting. Now let's see how you can apply this knowledge in HDRP, which uses a very similar system to the one found in real cameras. By default, you might not be happy with the way the exposure is handled. And this is normal. This is something you have to tune for yourself, as we have no idea of the type of scene you will create in HDRP. For instance, the default settings might darken your objects too much when looking at the sky, or you might want to prevent dark parts of the scene from becoming too bright. Or overall, you might think the scene is just underexposed. To review all the default settings applied to your scene, open the HDRP default settings. If you scroll a bit, you will eventually find the default profile that is applied to any of your scenes. You can see that the exposure mode is set to automatic by default. Based on the version of HDRP you downloaded, these settings might differ slightly. So we're going to set the exposure ourselves. I could do it here in the default settings if I had a very simple scene with one light setup only. However, I have a fairly complex scene with 3 different time of days, so I will need to override the exposure settings with the volume system in every time of day. For this exercise, I will create a global volume, though in practice I would recommend you use local volumes instead if you have larger levels with many different zones that require their own exposure overrides, like interiors for instance. To override the exposure mode, which was set globally to automatic if you remember, simply tick the override checkbox. As you can see, the entire screen turned white. Why is that? It's because the default value for the exposure is set to 0. And if you remember correctly, an exposure value of 0 should be used for nighttime or very dark interiors. So obviously your camera is now wide open, ready to collect as much light as possible, and therefore everything turns white. To fix this, let's just override the fixed exposure and use a value that corresponds to bright daylight, somewhere around 13.5. Now, the exposure is literally fixed, and no matter where you look, the brightness of the image won't fluctuate anymore, no matter if you look at the sun or at a dark corner of your level. Don't get me wrong, the automatic mode is also very useful. It's the mode I use the most. As we've seen, by default, the exposure will be free-floating based on what the camera sees, and this might not be wanted. Thankfully, automatic mode provides several metering options to let you control how the scene lighting is sampled. First, the average mode will use the entire frame to calculate the target exposure. It is a very stable way to control the exposure. Then we have the spot meter, which only samples a small number of pixels right in the center of the frame. This mode is fairly unstable because very bright pixel in the middle of the image will force the exposure system to underexpose the whole scene, and dark pixel will overexpose the scene. Finally, we have my favorite method, which is the center weighted mode. In this mode, the entire frame is checked. However, higher importance is given to pixels in the center of the image. You get the best of both worlds. At this stage, you will still experience unwanted exposure changes when entering dark parts of your level. For instance, the sky will become totally overblown and look like a daylight sky. By opposition, placing the camera right in front of very bright pixels will force the exposure system to underexpose the whole frame and darken the entire sky, for example. To prevent this, HDRP provides the min and max limit. To avoid underexposing the image, simply lower the limit max parameter until you find an acceptable value. I will lower it until the sky becomes more visible. Then, to reduce the over-brightening of the image when looking at the majority of dark pixels in your scene, I will increase the limit min value until the sky looks less overblown. And I now have a perfectly tuned automatic exposure. Looking at very dark areas won't overexpose my sky, and having very bright objects in the view won't radically influence my final image. All this while still having a dynamic adaptation to the scene. You can also use the compensation mode to slightly over or underexpose the scene manually. However, be aware that the limit min and limit max will remain active, and therefore you won't be able to push the exposure beyond those two values. Only use the compensation to slightly nudge the exposure target. It should not be used to solve problems related to poor exposure setup. The curve mapping is only meant for expert users that want to remap the exposure curve. Add keyframes into the curve and change the exposure output on the y-axis for each input on the x-axis. It can be useful in very dynamic lighting scenarios such as open world games or in situations like this, where I want to specifically flatten the exposure curve for this particular time of day between 0 and 5 EV. However, it requires knowledge of exposure, and more often than not, a well-tuned automatic exposure can often offer the same result. Do you remember the exposure triangle I mentioned previously? In a real camera, the shutter speed, the aperture, and sensitivity control the exposure. Because HDRP focuses on physical correctness, of course, we also offer a physical camera that will let you set up your exposure like on a real camera. I will add a local volume to my camera to not pollute my scene view with unwanted exposure changes. Let's add a box collider so that my local volume gets proper boundaries. And after I created my profile, I can add an exposure override and set it to use the physical camera. When switching to this mode, you might notice the same phenomenon as when using the fixed exposure for the first time. The image might turn totally white or totally black. Let's head to the physical section of my camera and tune these three parameters. If you remember, I showed you this photo I took with a smartphone. Let's use these settings and see how HDRP handles it. I'll input 1.7 for the aperture, that's the f number, then 2480 for the shutter speed, and 100 for the ISO. And voila, I get a perfectly fine exposure for my daylight scene. I want to point out that this mode is technically very similar to the fixed exposure mode. So it is mostly recommended for static lighting conditions such as cutscenes or beauty shots, as it requires a fully manual setup. As a bonus, let's have a look at a real reference of the palace. It's a photo I took after I made the lighting for the palace. That's an important info. Again, I just need to switch the exposure mode to physical cameras and head to the physical section of my camera. To match my camera setup, I'll use ISO 800, 1/20th of a second, and f1.4. We're already in the right ballpark. Let's adjust the white balance to match the reference. I'll also reduce the fog density as it was a much clearer night than the lighting I decided to go for in this demo. Then I can slightly adjust the midtones to match the tone mapping on the camera, and maybe slightly adjust the night sky as it was darker than in the HDRI I chose. And here's the reference again for comparison. My point isn't about making a perfect comparison, it isn't at all. But you can be in the right ballpark, at least with HDRP, and you can certainly trust this renderer when you want to make high-quality lighting for your AAA games. Finally, I want to emphasize that no one forces you to use a correct exposure. You could decide, for whatever reason, to stick to a fantasy exposure that makes no sense physically. However, we'll see in a few minutes that you would then have to come up with light intensities that do not make any sense at all. And as a beginner, it is useful to better follow the rules initially. If you're an expert and understand the implications of not using a proper exposure, then please be my guest. You have to play with several key components to set up the lighting. First, the direct lighting is usually provided by the sun. Then we usually have a strong source of indirect lighting, which is the HDRI sky in my global volume. You can see how much impact it has on the indirect lighting in the scene. And finally, the fog, which at this time of day has a dramatic effect because it is lit by the sunlight. To visualize some of these lighting contributions, head to Window, Render Pipeline, and open the debug window. You can enable full screen lighting debug mode to see the contribution of each component. Direct diffuse will only render your lights without any indirect lighting, which means shadow will be black. Indirect diffuse will only show you the ambient lighting provided by your light bakes. Speaking of light bakes, let's see how you could bake this scene. Go to Window, Rendering, and open the lighting settings. You have to provide a volume profile that will be used for baking. It's the one currently active in the viewport. It's an overcast lighting condition, ideal to bake the indirect only. Make sure you pick the HDI sky for the static lighting to match the sky type in the baking profile. For this scene, I will only create an indirect only bake so that I can reuse the bake in multiple lighting conditions later for afternoon, evening, and night. I'll now brush over the light mapper setting as it's beyond the scope of this session. First, pick the GPU light mapper as it can greatly reduce the baking time. Then activate the AI denoiser as it can provide great results with a fairly low amount of direct and indirect samples. And finally, set the texel resolution based on the quality you're after. In this case, I'm using 8 texels per unit, that's meter in this case, which is more than enough to capture the soft indirect light bake I'm after. Let's hit the generate button and wait for the bake to complete. You can keep working on the scene, the GPU light mapper will work in the background. It can be many times faster than the CPU, nearly 10 times faster in this example. Note that only mesh renderers marked to receive global illumination from light maps will be baked into the light maps. Otherwise, they would need to rely on the light probe groups, which I'm not using for this demo as I do not have any dynamic objects in the scene. Let's wait for the bake to complete. It should take a bit more than half a minute for this level. And we are done. I can now modulate the intensity of this bake with an indirect lighting controller in my global volume. So, how do you set up the direct lighting in your scene? That could be your sun, the moonlight, or your artificial lights. HDRP is physically based, and it offers real-world light units. This is something beginners can have trouble to understand, but it's just a matter of looking up values in a table, inputting them in Unity, and that's it. No more guessing, wondering if the sun intensity should be 3.2 or 17.6, which it isn't, by the way. There are many tools to measure the amount of lighting received, emitted, or sent towards a specific direction. A lux meter will measure the lighting received in a certain area. It is useful to measure the sunlight, the skylight when in the shade, or the general lighting received on a walking top. The light is collected by the small hemisphere, and then a sensor reads the intensity. The unit is lux, that's what Unity uses for the sunlight and the sky intensity. Then we have the integrating sphere, which measures the entire output of a given light source, like a bulb or a tube light. The bulb is turned on, the door is closed, and the light bounces around in the white sphere, and a sensor will read the light intensity. It is important to understand that this measurement doesn't give you any information about the directionality of the light. The unit is lumen, and Unity supports it as well. It is a great unit for point lights shining light uniformly in all directions. Then finally, we have the gonio-photometer, which is able to calculate the intensity coming from any angle around the light source. This is usually used to measure lights that have reflectors to focus the light in particular directions, like headlights and spotlights. If you're familiar with architectural rendering, this is how IES profiles are generated. The unit for it is Candela. Unity supports it too. It's great for spotlights, for instance. Here's a quick roundup of useful intensities for your directional light. As you can see, the range is huge, from 0.001 lux all the way to 120,000 lux for the sunlight. Let's see how it looks in Unity. When you add a light to your scene, you might sometimes wonder why you can't see it. If I add a directional light and keep its intensity at 3, you can see that the light doesn't seem to contribute at all in my scene, yet I still pay the processing cost of this light under the hood. The physically correct value for the sunlight around noon is roughly 100,000 lux. When using proper exposure for the scene, you can see that it looks correct at this value. Let's also tune the color temperature. When the sun is high in the sky on a clear day, the temperature should be roughly around 5500 Kelvin, depending on the atmospheric conditions. Again, if you don't use a physically correct color temperature for your sun, you will immediately break the photorealism of the image. What about your sky? You can use your own multiplier, or simply input the exact exposure you desire. For this bright afternoon sky, I'll use EV 14.5. After the long session previously about exposure, there should be no secret about it anymore. You can even tell HDRP the lux value you need, and it will automatically expose the sky for you based on your input. To make my point regarding the importance of using the right light intensity for a given exposure, let's simulate a sunlight for our night scene. As you can see, the image is totally overblown. Let's revert back to the correct value of half a lux. The color temperature of the moonlight is actually fairly warm at 4100 kelvins. When activating my artificial lighting, you can see that the image remains perfectly balanced. Let's have a look at their intensity too. Let's turn on my street lamp prefab, which contains the emissive bulb and the light. The light is set to 2500 lumen, which is roughly equivalent to a 200 watt incandescent bulb. Where can you find these intensity values? Simply shop around. Every light bulb has a spec sheet where you can find the lumen output and the color temperature. Simply input those in Unity and you're set. There is, however, a little complication for spotlights if you want to use them with lumens. Let's pretend you found on the web a car headlight ranked at 2000 lumen and a bluish tint at 7000 Kelvin. Like this, it doesn't look very powerful at all for a headlight. Did they lie, or is there something wrong with Unity? None of that actually. You need to enable the reflector flag. Display the advanced options and tick the reflector checkbox. Let's also activate shadows too. Now the headlight looks perfectly believable. When the reflector flag is turned off, actually the spot will behave like a point light in terms of light intensity. This can be useful if you don't want the lighting to change when switching between point and spotlight. However, this isn't really physically correct. Therefore, I highly recommend you enable the reflector mode if you work with lumens. Like in real life, if you increase the cone of the light, you will reduce its luminous intensity, and if you focus the beam, the luminous intensity will radically increase. For instance, this is how tactical torchlights work. They don't necessarily have a very high lumen output, but they have a great reflector able to focus the light for maximum effect in a very narrow cone of light. As you can see, when switching between light units, Unity will automatically do the conversion for you, so you don't have to do the math. Finally, if you don't like any of these units and prefer a more artistic way to control the light, I would suggest you use the EV100 units. Each increment of this value will actually double the luminous intensity of the light. In technical terms, you're increasing or decreasing the intensity by one stop. We've talked a lot about lights, but what about shadows? In the HDRP quality settings, you'll be able to tune their default resolution, precision, and overall quality. I'll focus on the directional shadows first. Let's have a look at the shadow section in our sun's inspector. The update mode is particularly useful if you want to force HDRP to refresh the shadows constantly or not. If you have a dynamic sun, for instance, you'll certainly want to keep this mode to every frame. When set to on enable, the shadows will only be generated when the light gets activated. Obviously, if the sun or any other object moves, even the camera, you could be in trouble. You can also pick the shadow resolution you wish for any light. The lower resolution, the blurrier they will look and the less connected to their shadow caster they might be. Very high resolution without appropriate filtering might look very sharp, however. More on this in a minute. The values for low, medium, and high can be tuned in the HDRP quality settings. Scroll to the shadow section and tune these numbers to fit your project's need. You can also use a dimmer if you want to simulate semi-transparent shadows, as well as changing the color of the shadow produced by this light only, if you want to simulate the light going through a tinted window, for instance. Don't abuse of this feature, however, as normally shadows should be pure black in practice for opaque objects. With the medium filtering quality, our high-resolution shadow will look artificially sharp. This can be radically improved by activating the high-quality filtering in the HDRP quality settings. Now, the shadows will become blurrier the further they are from the shadow caster, exactly like in real life. Obviously, there is a performance hit associated with this mode. You can see how dramatic the difference is between medium and high quality. The blurriness is controlled mainly by the angular diameter of the light. The bigger the source, the blurrier the shadows, like in the real world. A value around 0.5 degrees should be used for the sun to correctly simulate its angular size from the perspective of the Earth. Let's have a look at the shadow debug view with the render pipeline debug mode. In the lighting tab, I'll activate the full screen debug view for our sunlight. Now you can appreciate the effect is more obvious. For comparison, here's the medium filtering quality, and here's the high quality one. And remember that this effect works for point and spotlights as well. Let's tune again the angular size of the light to showcase the effect. It is definitely one of my favorite features in HDRP. I can also tune the shadow cascade settings with the volume system. Cascaded shadows are only used for the directional lights. Other lights won't rely on this technique at all. I can tune the maximum distance my sun shadows are going to be rendered at. Let's keep it at 200 meters for this area. I can then override the distance splits for each cascade. Let's activate the debug view to easily tune them. At first, I'll only have 2 cascades to better showcase the features. I can control how cascades are spread by changing the split distance. I can also tune the blending between both cascades by overriding the border value. Without this blending, the shadow transition between each cascade would be very harsh. In fact, each cascade will halve the resolution to keep the shadowing cost down. You will most likely want to use as many cascades as possible. You should tune them in a way that each one roughly fills a quarter of the screen in order to spread the cost efficiently, while maximizing the quality at short range. What about shadows for point and spotlights? They don't use the same cascade system as the directional lights, otherwise they are very similar in their behavior. Let's have a look at common issues on point lights instead related to shadow biasing. Let's activate the shadow debug view in the debug window. First, you can tune the near plane and increase it as much as you possibly can to get maximum shadow precision. Make sure you don't push it too high, otherwise objects between the light and this near plane won't cast any shadows. The slope scale depth bias is incredibly useful to solve any stepping you might see on surfaces perpendicular to the light. In the past, such artifact would have been fixed by increasing the normal bias, but this had the negative effect of sinking the shadows inside the objects. The shadow fade distance is a very practical feature to make the shadow disappear beyond a certain distance. This is incredibly important when optimizing the lighting, as rendering many shadows at the same time, especially from point lights, is expensive. It is very common for current-gen games to have a shadow distance under 30 meters, by the way. Finally, you can also impact the shadow blurriness of the light by tuning its radius, like on the directional light I've shown you before. This also has the effect of reducing the sharpness of the specular highlights produced by this light, like in reality. Activating the full-screen specular lighting debug mode will make this effect more obvious. The last weapon in your arsenal for shadows are the contact shadows. These are using the information on the screen to generate additional shadow details by remarching in a depth buffer. It is a very useful technique that can fill the holes due to the lower resolution in the shadow cascades, especially at medium and long range. You can add a contact shadow override to one of your volumes to set your own settings, such as the length of the rays set in meters. Enabling the contact shadow debug view will make it easier to demonstrate. As usual, you will have the choice between low, medium, and high quality. You can tune this in the HDRP quality settings. You can use your own sample count. Be aware that this will, of course, increase the impact on the performance potentially. By the way, don't worry about the flickering in the debug views. This is only related to the temporal anti-aliasing. The contact shadows can also be very useful at long range beyond the maximum shadow distance for the directional light. As a test, let's set the sun shadow distance to 0 and see how the contact shadows will behave. Here's my scene with contact shadows off and then on. As you can see, the effect could provide a decent shadow fallback for distant objects that are visible on screen. I've been talking about lights and shadows. The next component we will study is the reflections. In HDRP, your sky will be automatically reflected onto the scene. However, how can you get your objects to reflect as well? For this, you will need to manually place reflection probes. These will capture the surrounding environment and then cast the specular information onto nearby objects. Then, another technique will be screen space reflections, which will attempt to reflect the scene onto the entire frame. As we'll see, this feature has many caveats. First, let's look into the reflection probes. As I said, these are objects that you manually place inside the world. As you can see in this chrome ball, the reflection of the statue doesn't seem to match the actual scene. This is because the capture point of the reflection probe that affects my chrome ball is relatively far away. My point is that those reflections have a fixed position in space, and therefore you need to place them in your environment as you please to ensure the reflections are as good as required for your project. Here's another case where my chrome ball doesn't receive correct reflection. To fix this, I have created a reflection probe with a box shape to capture the surrounding columns and shield this area from the sky reflection. Finally, my chrome ball receives decent reflections that match this area. As it moves away from my box-shaped reflection probe, it will receive the reflection from the other probe in the center of the arena. The probes in HDRP have many new features compared to the built-in render pipeline. Therefore, I invite you to go through the documentation to get familiar with all the new functionalities, such as the projection settings, the reflection proxy volumes, and the new planar reflections that are great for flat surfaces and mirrors. In the probes inspector, you can set the probe type to baked. The resulting reflection will be baked into a texture. This mode is great for static scenes without many dynamic objects. When set to real time, the probe will be generated on the fly. You can set it to refresh only when the object is activated, or every frame, which is very expensive. However, it is a great way to get real-time reflections for dynamic objects. For instance, when I move the statue, I can see the reflection updating in real time on my chrome ball. To reduce the cost of such reflections, you should also take a look into their frame settings in the HDRP default settings. You might want to disable certain expensive effects globally. Or you can tune each probe individually with the custom frame settings in the inspector of the probe. For instance, you could disable MSAA so that the probe won't render the world using the expensive anti-aliasing. You can curl transparent objects, decals, shadows, or fog. It will entirely depend on the type of game you're doing, how you use the probes, how many you have, and if they are set to refresh constantly or not. As a rule of thumb, if you cannot see the visual benefits of a given feature, you should try to keep it off, or at least minimize its impact as much as possible. The final component of the reflection system is screen space reflection, or SSR for short. To use them, make sure the feature is enabled in the HDRP quality settings. The SSR settings can be tuned with the volume system as well. As the name suggests, this technique only relies on the screen data. It is unable to provide reflections for objects outside the screen. The usage is therefore fairly limited, but it can provide great reflections on flat surfaces parallel to the camera. As I move my chrome ball, you can see that it actually occludes the reflection from the lamp behind. This is because the renderer doesn't have any knowledge of the world behind opaque objects. If we enable the screen space reflection debug view, the effect is easier to assess. For instance, you can tune the minimum softness of the materials that will be able to receive the effect with a couple of sliders. You can also decide if the effect should consider the sky or not when applying the reflection. In case you see strong artifacts on the side of the screen, you can increase the edge fade distance. As usual, you will find the low, medium, and high quality settings in your project settings. You're always free to use the custom quality and tune the number of samples to boost the quality. However, be aware of the potential additional costs. I must admit, I'm not a particular fan of this effect. I usually prefer well-placed reflection probes in my environment that will give me near-perfect 360 degrees reflections. However, as a fallback, screen space reflection can be acceptable for certain use cases where having too many probes isn't feasible. Obviously, the main drawback will be that those reflections will disappear as soon as the reflection caster will be off-screen. The fog and its volumetric effect simulate the atmosphere and give a better sense of depth. Volumetrics can dramatically improve the visual quality of your levels. Make sure they are enabled in your HDRP quality settings. The high-quality mode is designed for very high-end platforms. Think twice before enabling it. To tune the fog, you will need to use a fog override assigned to a volume. The fog attenuation distance will let you create a wide range of atmospheres. Like in real life, increasing the fog density will also dim the sunlight. Obviously, turning off the volumetric checkbox will revert the fog to its unlit mode, making the scene a lot less dramatic, in this example at least. By the way, in case you cannot afford the volumetric fog, an alternative is to rely on the sky to tint the fog. You can tune how far the effect extends and control the sharpness of the effect by tuning the MIP level of the sky used to tint the fog. Obviously, the effect won't be as great visually as the volumetric fog, but it can provide a boost in quality compared to a flat unlit fog. I can also tint the volumetric fog color. However, scientifically speaking, the fog should remain as colorless as possible in order to pick up the color from the sky and ambient lighting. The anisotropy is particularly useful to create front or backscattering for the particles in the air. A positive value will increase the fog brightness towards the light source, whereas a negative value will have the opposite effect. If you activate the advanced settings, you will be able to tune the depth extent, which controls how far from the camera the volumetrics are rendered. Increasing the uniformity will in practice give a more linear precision to the effect, no matter the distance to the camera, whereas a low value will provide a greater precision near the camera. This slider is useful if you notice nearby fog is lacking resolution, for instance. The filter checkbox is very useful if you notice strong noise and flickering around light sources. An alternative way to reduce flickering is to use the reprojection in the frame settings of the camera. However, this effect only works in the game view. You could activate both at the same time to reach the best quality, but this would potentially have a fairly high performance cost. To create more local pockets of fog in your level, you will have to use the density volumes. Add the game object to your scene and tune its size. You can use the very practical handles to resize it. Each density volume can have a custom density, as well as a custom blend distance to fade the harsh transition at the edge of the volume. Let's assign a 3D noise texture to it, and let's jump into game to see the effect on the cutscene camera. You can tune the speed of the effect to something more reasonable, as well as changing the tiling of the 3D noise. As you can see, the anisotropy will also affect the fog around my local lights. The effect is very stable, and transition at the edge of the density volume can be seamless. And finally, you can tune the color of this particular density volume. Again, scientifically speaking, using white will ensure that the fog only picks up its color from the surrounding lighting. These density volumes are terrific. They can really enhance the atmosphere wherever you need, without having to mess with the global fog. A very common effect you'll see in games these days is screen space ambient occlusion. It is used to simulate the lack of indirect lighting in parts of the image. It is very useful if you don't have a light bag or AO maps, or if you have many dynamic objects in your scene. To use it in your project, enable the screen space ambient occlusion in the HDRP quality settings. To control this effect, just add an ambient occlusion override to your volume and you will be set. You can play with the intensity until you reach the desired result. Make sure to not abuse of this effect, as it can introduce cartoony results. By the way, the SSAO in HDRP gets tinted by the albedo to offer the best possible quality. It isn't just a monochromatic effect like in many other game engines. Then, you can control the influence of the effect in areas affected by direct lighting, such as sunlight or artificial lights. This effect isn't very realistic, but it can help ground objects into the scene. Then, you can tune the radius of the effect, which might help you get a wider AO around your objects. However, larger radiuses will come at a cost. To tune these effects, it can be useful to use the render pipeline debug window and enable the SSAO debug mode. This view is very practical to tune the radius and steps used for this effect. It is much easier to judge the quality of the effect as well. You can pick a quality level too. Those are actually set in the HDRP quality settings. You can use them to have more granularity on the quality and cost in different areas of your game, for instance. If you pick the custom mode, you can then freely override any quality settings underneath. And make sure you hit the More option button to display all the hidden advanced parameters. Of course, using the full resolution mode will give you the best quality. However, it will noticeably increase the cost of the effect. The major drawback of screen space AO is that it can only rely on depth information in the current frame. This means it has zero knowledge of the world itself, and it can only use what the camera sees to produce the darkening. If you pan the camera left and right, you will see the effect appears and disappears on the edge of the screen. Obviously, it is more visible when using the debug view. HDRP provides a very useful tool to manage your lighting objects. Go to Window, Rendering, and open the Light Explorer. You will be presented with a list of all lighting-related objects, such as lights, volumes, and reflection probes. It also offers the possibility to edit some of their most important settings. You can, for instance, tune the color of the light, their intensity, and if they cast shadows, as well as the shadow resolution, without having to leave the Light Explorer. Each property can be sorted, so it can be very useful, for instance, to find the brightest lights in your scene, the ones that don't cast shadows, or even order them by color temperature. There's no doubt the Volume tab will be very convenient because tracking where volumes are and which ones are active can be very difficult if you aren't familiar with the scene. This is because the volume components can be added to any game objects, and therefore they can be tricky to track. You can even use a Light Explorer to apply settings to your lighting prefabs. Simply select your objects and use the right-click to either apply the settings or revert them. This is a very useful feature when you want to standardize the lighting across all your lamps without having to leave the scene view. Now, let's look into a very nice HDRP feature, the light layer system. As a lighting artist, I can tell you this is the best thing since sliced bread. You can use it to tell which lights or reflection probes should affect a certain set of objects. In this example, I will place a light in the garage behind the doors. For this scenario, I've reduced the shadow fade distance to 20 meters. That's a very typical distance for many games these days, especially when you have hundreds of them on screen. As I move the camera more than 20 meters away from the light will stop rendering its shadows and I get unwanted light leaking. This is expected, but as a lighter, light leaking is my worst nightmare. Fixing this problem with HDRP is very simple, thanks to the light layer system. I just need to reassign the light to another layer than the default one. I'll pick the interior light layer, for instance. Now you can see that the light leaking is fixed, and the light will only be able to affect objects tagged with the interior light layer. I'll assign the guard HUD to the same interior layer, and you can see that the HUD is now affected by the light, as they are both on the same layer. Obviously, in this scenario, this light leaking isn't wanted. However, you might have situations where you want outdoor lights to cast lights in the interior only, for instance to fake natural lights coming through windows. Here's another example where light layers can be incredibly practical. That's for a cutscene scenario. I have my cinematic camera set up with custom post-processing effects, and my character is surrounded by 3 cutscene spotlights. I'm not satisfied that the columns are being affected by these cutscene lights. To fix this, it's very simple. I assign the light to the cutscene layer only. I then select my character and mark it to be affected by the cutscene light layer. Now the lights will only affect my character and they won't affect the rest of the environment. If you've ever done cutscene lighting before, you can certainly understand how practical this is. HDRP even pushes further by offering control over the shadowing of these light layers. I can prevent the objects on the default light layer from casting shadows from my cutscene lights. I can even tell my characters to not cast shadows from these lights. Obviously, this is quite a niche feature. However, having the ability to prevent an entire set of objects to not cast shadows from very specific lights is quite common in real productions, where you don't want to get parasite shadows from unwanted props entering the cones of your spotlights. For the last part of this session, I'll focus on post-processing effects. Let's start with tone mapping. Tone mapping is an effect applied to an HDR image in order to display it on a low dynamic range display, like most screens on the market today. By default, HDRP will use the AACES tone mapping curves, which will give a filmic look to your image, with increased contrast, notably in the shadows and also slightly desaturated highlights. As you can see, using no tone mapping at all will be terrible for your image quality. All the highlights in your image will be clamped. The neutral tone mapper, on the other hand, will provide a fairly flat look, preventing harsh shadows and clamped highlights. It's a great tone mapper to use when reviewing assets like materials and textures, as you do not want to apply unnecessarily contrast and desaturation to them. Then again, we have the AACES tone mapper. You can see that it is more contrasted than the neutral one. It will have a better highlight reproduction and will desaturate them slightly as well. With the custom mode, you can create your own tone mapping curve to achieve a specific look. You have control over the shadows and the highlights via the toe and shoulder controls on the curve. This mode should be reserved to expert users, however, as you can introduce unwanted contrast and may unnecessarily darken the image, for instance. For beginners, I would highly recommend you stick to the AACES tone mapper. Next is white balance, which is a very important effect when using physically correct colors for your lights. In real life, cameras or your brain will attempt to automatically adapt to the environment by compensating strong color casts they see. It is important to use this effect at night, for instance, when you have very warm incandescent lights in your world that produce a very orange color cast. You might want to fix this by lowering the temperature, which will in effect reduce the reds and push the blues in your image. Alternatively, you can also be creative with this effect and use it as a color filter. Bloom is often an effect that is being abused in games. Thankfully, HDRP now provides a physically correct bloom that will simulate light bouncing around in your lens and in practice reduce the clarity of the image. Increasing the bloom intensity to the maximum value will basically heavily blur the image. You then control how much light is being scattered across the lens with the scatter slider. If you want to create a less realistic effect, we do still provide a threshold slider that allows for discarding the blurring effect on pixels under a certain limit. Finally, you can also tint the bloom in an artistic fashion, though for correctness, white should be your color of choice, as the color of the bloom should depend on the scene lighting. The last effect I will mention is the depth of field, DOF for short. What is it exactly? When you take a photo, you or the camera will focus on a subject. This subject will be sharp, hopefully. The depth of field will be the distance between the closest and furthest points that appear sharp in the image. So to make sure everything is in focus, you will need a huge depth of field, whereas if you want your foreground and background heavily blurred, that's called bokeh, you will need a very shallow depth of field. This effect is controlled by the aperture on the lens. If the lens is wide open, you will have a very low depth of field, and if the lens is closed, you will get a high depth of field. So again, DOF doesn't mean blurriness. That's often something beginners wrongly associate with depth of field. A large dov is actually a synonym of sharpness in practice. As usual, you can control the dov with the volume system, for instance by adding a local volume to your cutscene camera. HDRP has two distinct modes. The first one is the manual mode that has no physical correctness. You are able to specify exactly where the sharpest point of the image starts and where it ends by controlling the near and far blur. Naturally, if you aren't careful, you can end up with totally unrealistic results that will raise a few eyebrows. As an example, if I create a very strong foreground blur, following by a very wide depth of field, it will look unrealistic. Therefore, you need to be careful when setting those distances, so that it doesn't look like you're bending the laws of physics. Otherwise, your player will notice it. At least I will. Now, if you head to the physical camera section, increase the aperture and you'll then be able to set the aperture bleed count. This will change the look of your bokeh circles in the background. Usually, more expensive lenses will have more than 7 blades in order to create rounder circles of confusion. Using a low value will look cheap, literally. Then, we of course also offer a physical mode that will be based on the aperture of the lens. In the volume, you can set the focus distance, but for the actual depth of field, head to the physical camera section instead. The lower the f number, the less depth of field you get, and the blurrier the background becomes. Increase the aperture, and your image will become sharper overall. HDRP also simulates many lens aberrations, such as lens distortion, which will, in practice, give a radial warp for your defocused areas, like on many real lenses. The effect is very subtle though. Finally, you can simulate an anamorphic look seen in higher production value content, something that can radically boost the cinematic quality of your cutscenes. Make sure you use a positive value to get this very specific effect. If you activate the advanced options for the dov overrides, you will be able to tune the quality of the effect more precisely. As usual, head to the HDRP quality settings to review them and tune them. Or simply, use your own by switching the quality to custom. Be aware that using the full resolution mode and increasing the samples will improve quality, but also greatly affect your performance, so choose very wisely. And we've finally reached the end of this session. I hope you've enjoyed it, and hopefully you've learned a few things. If you're new to lighting, it's a lot to digest, so I would suggest you have a look at the excellent documentation for HDRP online. Make sure you select the right version, as each version of HDRP brings many new features and improvements. Speaking of which, you can expect more improvements coming to the exposure system with more controls and better debugging tools, light layers and volume visual debug modes, as well as better temporal anti-aliasing and depth of field. Again, thank you for watching, and if you liked the video, please let me know. Take care and au revoir!